It's an absolute honor to be here and for this moment, which is, I think, a very big moment for any writer, which is the first time they are showing their book to the world, and it's their very first book. And the fact that he's doing this at Kerala Literature Festival in Calicut, Kozhikode, is obviously very special. Home turf. So, this is a first copy of the book. There are proper copies there for you to see, which is a hardback. But I thought I would start by setting the tone a little bit so you know what we're talking about, since obviously nobody's read the book yet. It's still very new. So I'm going to give you what the first few lines read like. And then we're going to talk to Saharu about it. So this is how Chronicle of an Hour and a Half begins. Nabi Summa. He gave me 5 children and then he rested like God after creation. He gave me 5 sons even before the 5th anniversary of our marriage. He named them Ibrahim, Imran, Dulkar, Rashid, and Burhan. Then he rested while I eked out a living scrubbing dishes, washing clothes, mopping floors, tailoring chudidars and shalwars and blouses, dialing numbers all day at a telephone booth, rolling beedies for a local cooperative brand, sewing and stuffing mattresses and pillows with kapok fiber for the communist mattress company. And so the book begins with Nabi Summa's voice. I'm going to ask Saharu to tell us what it feels like to be a writer at this point in his career, where it's just beginning, where he's finally able to say, I am a writer, I have a book out, and it's taken a while to get here. So what has that journey been like for you?
A journey as a writer or the journey of this particular book?
I think both, because it is the beginning.
All right. So I did...
Can you hear, Saharu? No, mic needs to be closer.
Am I audible now? Yeah. So
maybe hold it like
I became a writer not because of any philosophical reasons. I became a writer because I wanted to be a writer. And I persevered in this pursuit for some 10 years. Now that it's 2024, I quit my PhD in 2014 in order to dedicate myself to a career in fiction writing. Not exactly fiction writing, because earlier my first plan was to dedicate myself to poetry writing. Then I discovered that I'm not a good poet, but I did have good learning in poetry that set the tone for an aspiration to become a novelist. And I did complete 2 novels in quick succession. And in quick succession, I ate 2 rejections also, countless rejections for those 2 novels. Now, this is the 3rd novel that I have written, and this is also the shortest time I had taken in order to finish the novel, which is fascinating because it's structurally very demanding. It's also extremely short. There is a brevity to it, to each narrative. Now, most of you do not know what is inside there. So let me just give you a short introduction in few sentences what this book is about. The book is about, its title is Chronicle of an Hour and a Half, indicating that it's about an event which transpires in an hour and a half. And the event that takes place is the mob lynching of a young man, 25-year-old Burhan, over an extramarital affair. Most of you are Malayalis, and you know that it's very, very possible. And there were examples also, multiple times over the years, which I had come to know, in which men had been lynched by mobs, but through various means, not necessarily by stoning, but some other means as well. Sometimes they didn't get killed immediately, then they died 3-4 days later at the hospital. So it did come to my attention. There was an incident in Calicut district, which happened in 2011. It's called Shahid Bawa murder case, in which a young man, I think they were more or less the same age, in which this man was lynched. not lynched exactly, not lynched right away. I mean, he died 7 days later in the Calicut Medical College. Now, that has nothing to do with my writing as such, the story as such. It has zero connection with the event. But I'm pointing out in order to connect set the context for the book, which means that no, there is a context for mob lynching in Kerala over extramarital affair. So this is the novel. Now, secondly, the novel is complex because novel has 14, 15 narrators. That's an extremely difficult task to carry out 15, 14 narrators in a span of 200 pages, among whom most of them are, not most of them, but there were characters who are kids, the narrators who are also 50-year-old illiterate women, not illiterate exactly, but not overly educated. And you had to also, coalesce the narrative around this event. And coalesces in such a way that, each of the narrators' life also comes to the reader's light in glances, not exactly in descriptions, in detailed description, but in glances. So yeah, this novel has multiple narrators, and all of them describes an event which transpires in an hour and a half. That's the context for the novel.
Yeah, and I can tell you that it's a powerful novel in which violence, the violence of love, the violence of sex, of passion, but also the community and how it lives with the consequences of violence as it builds up. That's what this novel is about. And as someone who's read a lot of fiction in English recently and for many years now, I can tell you that this is a very, very unexpected novel. It's a very different novel. And what it does is tell a story about Kerala, about this part of the country and the state, and tells it from the ground up. So you could feel that any of you is participant in this narrative. It could be any one of you who's sitting in that village in that moment when the prayer is on in the mosque, when people come out in the rain and they find that WhatsApp has spread rumors and news that is going to galvanize them into action. What happens next? So it's also about what happens next. And you can't stop turning the pages to find out, will the horror that you think might be building up actually ends in horror, or will there be an escape for us as readers and as the characters? So I know it's not easy to talk about the characters without people reading about the characters, so let's not even talk about that. But let's talk a little bit about the influences, the way in which you came to this novel through your own reading. What I find fascinating is the fact that you did not have an opportunity to read sort of mainstream English language fiction as you were growing up. You came to it later in life. You came to reading in university, in Naligarh, in JNU, and then you started to push yourself to write. So what then are your influences? Are they mostly of life and observation and the human mind as you study it? Or is it actually textual references? We all know that literature in Malayalam somewhere looks to Latin American fiction, for instance, as an inspiration. Does that even come into your mind? Or do you come from some completely unique place in the way you've come to English writing?
I'll start answering by giving a very scandalous answer, which is that, no, I'm going to give you a very scandalous answer, which is that I read, what's the title of that book? Marquez, most famous
100 Years.
100 Years of Solitude. Yeah, I read it in 2022, I guess. I never discovered any Latin American writer except Borges. And Borges was a very early influence, and reading Borges was a very elevating experience to me, not only because he wrote short, precise sentences and very mystical realities, but he was very scholastic, etc. He was extremely, hugely referential. That's all true. But I also took an extreme interest in the non-fiction writing of Borges, where I discovered that there is a very short essay, not essay even, 2 paragraphs, called Kafka and His Precursors. Now, this particular, I don't know, what is it? It's an essay?
Essay?
It's supposedly an essay. It has 3 paragraphs. That's Borges' brevity. He says that more than anything, 10 pages is boring. So he confines himself to 10 pages. So in this book, he said that, each writer creates his own precursors. So I had this desire to become a writer, and I did not have a precursor. And I thought that, I should immediately find a precursor. So I read Borges, and I discovered that Borges has translated Whitman. And Borges has translated Wallace Stevens. And Borges has also tried translating Hartcrane, which couldn't quite work because Hartcrane is an extremely difficult poet to translate. So I went from Borges to Whitman, and from Whitman to Stevens, and I got stuck with Stevens for some 6-7 years. And I began to write in such a way that extremely abstract poems, very Platonistic poems.
Very bad poems, basically.
Very bad poems too. I mean, they were very bad. But from Stevens, I inherited something very important, which is that language can be written in such a way that images more clearer than what I could perceive through the eyes, human eyes, could be created through a certain way of the use of language. That I inherited, and when I abandoned writing poem very early, I mean, I tried for 2 years, then I abandoned it, then I went to become a fiction writer. Everything that I write are very obsessed with image making. So the one central character of this novel, so there are some 15 narrators, but there is a mob. But also one of the major characters, not character, but you call it character, in the novel is the rain. So rain is going from the moment the novel starts till the last page, it's a relentless rain. And I couldn't have done that without having a very strong groundedness in Stevensonian poetry. I read Sunday Morning when I was, that's the first poem I read. And I still remember the lines.
No.
Very elevating.
I told you not to quote poetry.
She has asked me not to recite poems, so I'm not going to.
But you also said that somewhere you found your way to Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti. Didn't you talk about Jiddu
Pardon?
Krishnamurti?
I didn't get it.
Krishnamurti.
I did. So the first English, I'm not an English, I didn't have an English education, so I taught myself English after going to Aligarh. So when I went to Aligarh, my hope was that this was the Cambridge of India, and I'm coming back in English, I'm going to stun everybody. Instead, the Aligarh stunned me, and instead of learning English, I became quite good at Urdu and Hindi. But on the other hand, Aligarh has an extremely rich library. It had some 12 lakh book collection. And I used to go there, and one day I discovered a book called Freedom from Fear, and it was authored by Jiddu Krishnamurti. And that was the first book that I ever read. My journey to literature has very little to do with a literary education. I just saw a book in a bookshop in which an author has used his mother's name in the middle, as the middle name. And it suddenly struck me that I could, make my mother also proud by writing a book. And when I publish a book, I could use my mother's name in the middle. So I'm a very, very common man who aspired to become a writer in order to make his mother proud. And later, that aspiration led me to read Faulkner, Pinjon, Don DeLillo, who became, I call him my precursor, because I read him so much that Underworld is a novel 900 pages long, and I had read it at least 50, 60 times.
Wow.
So I'm obsessed with Don DeLillo. I'm obsessed with Cormac McCarthy. And I discovered that the way they use language is what sets them apart. This is what I said for myself in order to become a writer. I was convinced that until language becomes a religion unto itself, you shouldn't be committing to fiction writing.
So Saharu, I must say that in many ways you are standing outside of the canon of the literary novelist in English in India. I think most everyone will agree that they come from a very privileged place. They come from English being the language they think in. But I'm guessing you think in Malayalam, right?
Yeah, to my first girlfriend, I used to answer thinking in Malayalam and then speaking in English. And she used to tell me that you think in Malayalam and then tell me later there is a gap between your thinking and speaking.
So she left you, I presume.
Huh?
So she left you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Most certainly.
But okay, so we have a really short session here, and we have like 15 minutes to go. So I think we have 10 minutes to go.
We have 15 minutes to, no, okay.
No, 9 minutes, 35 seconds.
That's not, okay.
Yeah. So do I ask you to read a little bit to give people a little sense of the book? Yeah.
I can.
Let's do that.
So this is one of the characters who is recounting, this is the mother character, and she's recounting her early life. So here you go. They married me off across the river on a bright summer day in late May 1986. The water used to be much cleaner then, and on a clear 14th night you could see the flawless dunes of white sands and little shadows of orange chromats and garfish and schools of Jan Danios as they swam, dimpling the surface in their trail. In deep summer, the river used to shrink, bearing the undulant sand dunes. As evening approached, they filled up with picnickers and spotters and hawkers. Kids ran with paper kites or trace iron fillings in the sands with bits of magnets wrapped in bits of paper. At dusk, just as the calls for Maghrib prayers rose from all the mosques in and around the town and from the villages beyond the river, 1,000 bats took flight from the dense palms along the banks in waves against the late colors of the sun. It was at this time of the year that the nomads with their obscure tongues and acrobatic children used to put up their canvas tents on the sands and set up their great circuses, and the nights were great fun. Then my parents married me off. They came to my home on a boat, the groom and his aunties and uncles and the men in the village, and I went with them down the stairs into the river, across the river on the same boat that brought them, and trekked 4 kilometers up the trails towards his home under the harsh blue sky and the white glaring sun, through coconut hills and paddy fields and sesame fields and granite quarries and cashew orchards with their pungent red fruits, canopies of teaks with meandering trails flanked by wild pineapples redder than red roses, and streams with boulders as old as the earth, with water clear as glass, infested with water spiders and trout still and pensive as hermits, black as rocks. Even then I was confused, walking with my groom who wore a white mundu and white polyester shirt with a plaited handkerchief tucked under its collar, fairer, older, a good 2 feet taller, yet somehow slower than me. Even then I was confused about this strange man, my life to come, the responsibility of having to give birth to children soon and the liability of having to love them more than myself because I was merely 19. I wasn't finished loving myself enough. I married him because he was 14 years older than me, and that single factor slashed the dowry by more than half, and that was not a deal my father could have rejected even though my husband had no job. He got so late to marry because he was so lazy to marry. When my father asked him about his job, he said he would look for one with a kind of burdened assurance, and my father agreed. He agreed because I had 4 younger sisters, waiting for their turn with all their burden of dowries and brown skin. And then I was pregnant each year. A ritual much like Ramzan. And each child was like a bomb, an explosion of confusion. I didn't even know I had any part in it. The children were just coming out of me despite myself, as if my body was growing new limbs without my consent. And by the time I was aware, the house was full of their hungry noise, like a few eternally whistling pressure cookers. And I lay sleeplessly beside my husband who couldn't get it up on the bed. Not anymore.
Yeah. Those are the lives he writes about. We have 5 minutes. Is there anybody who has any comment to make? Anything to say?
And you mentioned that every writer has his own precursors. Was Louis Borges?
Can you speak louder? I can't hear
Okay.
you.
Every writer has his own lineage or DNA or precursor. Then my question is regarding whether Walt Whitman, Wallace Stevens were part of your DNA or your predecessors. Or Borges, more than that, Borges was a predecessor.
I understood that it's largely I don't have clarity on what you're asking, but are you asking about why did I say so?
Yes, I want to clarify whether your writing DNA comes from that of Walt Whitman, Wallace Stevens, and Louis Borges.
Wallace Stevens' influence, I think.
Your DNA, your writing creativity DNA comes from that of Borges or Wallace Stevens or William Blake, Walt Whitman.
Stevens, you're talking about Stevens.
Wallace Stevens.
Wallace Stevens
Wallace.
and Walt Whitman.
Walt Whitman. Well, Walt Whitman, Song of Myself, for example, and the longer poems of Stevens, both had huge influence on me. Whitman is a very, very specific poet to have any strong influence on me because Whitman celebrates his body, and his Song of Myself, in fact, is a celebration of American democracy. And it also can be considered as hugely anchored on the individualistic notion. But Stevens is not directly responsible for my fiction, but the image making in my writing, which I do create, is indebted to Wallace Stevens. Now, there is a poet, Nicaraguan poet called Ruben Dario. Ruben Dario was a favorite of Borges, and Borges always approvingly quoted him. And the quotation was, there is no literary Adam, in the sense that there is no first writer. Every writer comes from other writers, and which is why Faulkner once said that, Picasso is not a writer, but Picasso still said that good writers steal and bad writers copy. So it's an endless, every writer, every major writer in the world has reflected on influence.
Yeah.
And I think my specific to this book structure is also indebted to As I Lay Dying by Faulkner. And I have also acknowledged that debt in the epigraph. I don't want to deceive anybody, but it's not quite the same, but I do know. For example, there is a character, 12-year-old character, June. And I couldn't have written that character without having read The Sound and Fury, and how the first 70 pages of Sound and Fury was written using the voice of a 35-year-old man with a 5 or 6-year-old's intelligence. So that gave me the confidence to set out to write a 12-year-old kid, because kids are extremely demanding characters and extremely difficult to write because you cannot put your adult words in her mouth. And yet, to keep the plot moving through a kid. So I thought that, that was primarily that influence came from Faulkner, who I really admire, especially 4 of his novels like Sound and Fury, As I Lay Dying, Light in August, and Absalom.
Okay,
I think everything else he wrote is trash also.
Shall I ask someone if they have anything more to ask? Is there any question or comment? You want to say something? Okay. Or she's just waving at you. So the thing about Saharu, and I do want, if there's no question, I want him to give us one sort of reflection on this, that he's a teacher. He teaches at college. He has students that he talks to. And then he writes a book which presumably the students will have an opinion on, for better or for worse. What is it like to be able to be a teacher, to have a certain way of speaking, thinking, reflecting so as to give them something in life, but also to have this private self where you write your own stories in your head, which is an intensely different career in your own head, right? So are there two identities here? Do they merge? Do they cross? Do they conflict? What happens to you?
I never identified myself as a teacher. It's very, very patently, even when I was in 2009, when I was trying to write very bad poems, I always told people that I'm a writer. Even when I knew that I didn't even know the language, I introduced myself as a writer, and I never took teaching. It's not that I don't take it seriously, of course. I engage my students, and the students are extremely receptive also to very revolutionary, very radical ideas. I don't know where that radicalism goes away. I think the moment they get out of the university, they are compelled down by the society in order to think, in the most stereotypical fashion. But students are extremely receptive.
Well, I'm going to have to stop because it's exactly time. But I hope you're going to be very receptive to this novel. And I think it's been very special to have Saharu talk for the first time about it here. We're hoping it's a bit of an experiment and a bit of a practice session.
Not experimental. Robert Penwaran once said that experimental is an elite word for flop.
Oh, okay.
And
no.
there is nothing experimental about fiction.
Okay, but we're going to hope that he will carry this forward
Discussion
to
later.
many more
Yeah.
conversations.
Yeah.
Take the book to the rest of the country and the world. Thank you for being here for this very first exposition. Thank you, Saharu.
Thank you all.
Thank you, speakers.